I like to show off my family whenever I start speaking, even after a break. It's kind of a nice little twist and a way to get things started again. And I do it by showing pictures of roadside attractions. When the kids were young, we would go on a lot of road trips out west and other places. And there's a lot of quirky things on the side of the road you can stop and take pictures of. And I'm a very quirky dad. So I made them stop and take pictures. And now I get to show them. So we have things like the world's largest vacuum cleaner.
That's great.
We have the world's largest tooth. I can't remember what the significance of the pig was. I don't know if anyone else knows. And a Minnesota actual roadside attraction is the Happy Chef.
Oh, yeah.
You may not know some useless facts about it. It's the first and last Happy Chef, and it's 36 feet tall, all the way up to the top of the spoon. Yeah, okay. So now we can jump in. We got that taken care of. And we are going to jump into evidence of things that can't be explained well. Again, we're looking at evidence and the explanations for that evidence. So we're going to look at some evidence that isn't explained very well by nature and materials, from my perspective. And the first one we're going to talk about is morality. Morality can be a little sensitive, like ice on your teeth. People don't tell me what to do, don't tell me what's right or wrong. But that's not actually what I'm going to talk about. I talked about two types of morality in this presentation. The first one I talked about with my kids. Right from wrong, where do I draw the line? This one's a little different than that. This is something called objective morals. Are there morals that exist that are independent of human opinion? In other words, they're wrong no matter what. The Nazis killed 7 million Jews. And they had no problem killing the kids, the children either. So you ask some questions on that in regard to morality. If the majority says something is okay, does that make it okay or is it still wrong? If the government passes laws that says it's okay, is it okay or is it wrong? If the scientific consensus says a race is not favored, in this case, is it still wrong what they did? If morals are just a product of culture and civilizations, then what they did then was their culture. It was their civilization. If morals are just chemicals in our brain, then they just did what their chemicals told them to do. How can they be held accountable? How could it be wrong? We're going to listen to a podcast of an atheist that makes the point for me.
One of the big problems with atheism, I'll admit, is that it doesn't have a sort of moral certitude about it. Because if you genuinely, I do happen to believe that I'm just a bundle of chemicals and neurochemicals, and I actually think that's a really kind of beautiful worldview. The fact that we all grew and evolved almost haphazardly, but in a direction, without the need for some kind of outside higher power. I quite like that worldview, but the problem, the flaw at the heart of it, that's especially relevant to being a parent, is like, well, there's no need for morality then, is there? There's no absolute right or wrong. Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor. It's just that's just a convention. Now, that bothers me a little. The older I get, the more that bothers me.
So he said some interesting things in there. I don't know if you caught the haphazardly, but in a direction. Yes. Don't kind of go together. But more importantly for this section, there is no absolute right or wrong. I do believe some things are wrong no matter what. I think torturing babies for fun is wrong no matter what. You can add fun almost to the end of anything, and it's not right. And the fact that we can detect injustice declares that there's an objective source of justice. Otherwise, it's just opinion. And the standard is not from nature, it's not from materials, it's not from the government, it's not from cultures, it's not from majority. It's a standard that seems to be implanted in us, right? An objective moral law that is beyond nature and materials. So nature and materials don't explain why we have this feeling. One of my favorite sections is the afterlife. I like to spend a lot of time on this. Can't going to spend a lot of time today because we're going to go through a lot of other stuff. But every culture since the dawn of mankind has had this concept of a continued existence. And it's astonishing if you actually think about it, that there's the universal belief in something that we can't see, we can't touch, we can't prove. Some studies are actually showing that infants are hardwired to believe in God in an afterlife. This is from Science News, 2011. Humans are predisposed to believe in God and the afterlife. This one was actually 57 researchers over 40 studies in 20 countries. Essentially what it's saying is that atheism is the worldview that has to be learned. This is C.S. Lewis. Some of you may have heard of him. He's the writer, the author of Chronicles of Narnia. You may or may not know this, but at age 17, he said, "I believe in no religion. There's absolutely no proof for any of them." But like Thomas Nagel, he was exposed to educated Christians, intelligent, educated Christians, and it made him question everything about his worldview. Eventually, he became what he quotes, what he calls the most reluctant convert to Christianity. So he says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger, well, there's such thing as food. A duck wants to swim, there's such thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, there's such thing as sex. If I find myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is I was made for another world. So the naturalistic worldview, I had to question, why this desire? Why would we want this? Why would we invest time and energy into a fake future world? It makes no evolutionary sense. I would expect the opposite. I'm going to focus on this life. I'm going to eat. I'm going to sleep. I'm going to reproduce. That's all that matters. And then we have near-death experiences, which fascinate me. They always have. People have experiences while they're dead. Sometimes they're verifiable. And they dream, or they have this afterlife experience where they see God, they see a tunnel, they see a bright light. I'm sure you've heard about them. And interestingly, they're becoming more and more common. And that's because medicine is bringing more and more people back to life after they've passed away. Also interesting is it transforms lives of most people who have them. There is a website, neardeath.org, Near Death Experience Research Foundation, and they're cataloging these. And you can go look at them and read them. They're fascinating. I was going to share one with you. This is a book called Touching Heaven. And in it, a cardiologist gives this story. A person came into the emergency room, happened to be a veteran, and he went into cardiac arrest. And he was in cardiac arrest quite a while. And they went and they got the defibrillator, that's the machine that shocks you back, and it didn't work. Rarely, if ever, does that happen. So they started frantically trying to get this thing to work, and they're trying different outlets. In the chaos, the IV line gets knocked out, goes under the table. The doctor himself actually goes under the table, gets the IV line, goes and puts it back in. Eventually, they bring in another defibrillator, they wheel it in, they plug it in, and they're able to actually bring him back to life. Well, first of all, he was angry. Why did you bring me back? That happens a lot.
Yeah.
The other world is fascinating, and they don't want to come back, many of them. But what was really interesting is after he got over his anger, is he explained everything that happened. From the new defibrillator bring in, which reminded that rarely, if ever, happens. He talked about the IV line, he talked about the surgeon going under the table. He had no heartbeat at the time. So, fascinating stuff. Lots of fascinating stories. I believe in near-death experiences. I believe something is happening. I don't know that I can explain it, but it happens so often. And now we're going to talk about the law of identity. The law of identity is pretty simple. Things are identical if they have the same qualities, same properties. 2 equals 2, an apple equals an apple, right? Simple. A tree is not a rose, a dog's not a cat. So, we have a brain. You can measure the brain. You can inspect it. You can dissect it. All of these things you can do with it. You can weigh it, you can measure it, but you have this brain, but there's a lot of things that aren't equal to the brain. They're not equal to the materials. The first one would be consciousness. So I talked about this a little earlier. You know, if I was a naturalist, animals, what do they think about? Eat, sleep, reproduce, and die. That's what we would think they think about. That's what you would expect from nature. But humans, unique to humans pretty much, is this awareness of me. Why do I exist? What is my purpose in life? I ask these bigger questions. Atheists like Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, they say it's just an illusion. It's the materials in your brain making an illusion of consciousness, of what we see. Of course, the problem with an illusion or a dream is you have to be outside of a dream to know it's a dream. You have to be outside the illusion to know it's illusion. A couple exceptions to that fact would be Neo and Cobb. If you watch those movies, then you know you're in a dream. By the way, those are favorite movies. Awesome movies. We also have The Conscience, another good movie, Kronk, from The Emperor's New Groove.
Oh, yes.
Yes, hilarious. Watch it if you haven't seen it. But Kronk has, as do we seem to have this voice telling us what to do. And there's this other voice too. No, do what you shouldn't do, right? Where do these come from? You can't inspect these. You can't measure them. The law of identity says it's not equal to the materials. Our 5 senses can't be measured. Think about it. Pain. When you go to the doctor, do they take something out to measure your pain? No, they say, look at this on the wall and tell me what your pain is, 1 to 10. Because I can't measure it. I can't inspect it. You have to tell me. You can add in things like memories, our dreams we talked about, feelings and emotions. We can't measure these things. So they're not identical to the brain. They're not materials. They're beyond the materials. But then Mr. Skeptic comes in and says, well, wait a minute, what about Alzheimer's? The science says it's the death of brain cells. The nerve cells in several brain areas shrink and die. We lose our memory. We lose all these qualitative things. So, it's one and the same, right? We lost the materials. Well, a couple things on that. First, if your Wi-Fi computer, or your Wi-Fi card in your computer stops working, the internet still exists. So it could be that the materials are a pathway to the spirit world. We talked about the NDE, we talked about some of that other talks, not longer. I talk about just more of the spirit world, which is fascinating. So maybe there's another world out there that this is a pathway to. But even more interesting, there's something called terminal lucidity. And this is, remember, science tells us the cells are gone. The brain cells are gone. But right before death, some of these patients remember things. They start talking like they were just talking 20 years ago, whatever it is, to their loved ones. They get all their memory back. For short-lived, and then they pass away. This is from an Alzheimer's disease specialist from Harvard. He says, even in Alzheimer's patients, a patient can, just before death, say goodbyes, remember their names, maybe recalling an event even a decade or so after learning. It's a complete mystery, but it's undeniable that it happens. It's amazing. Again, the materials are gone. How could they possibly remember? It shows me that they're not the same. So these were some evidences of things beyond nature and materials. And if just one of those things, objective morals, the NDEs I talked about, spirit, law of identity, if any of those are true, just one of them, then by definition, there's more than materials and naturalism. So you have to ask the question. You have to be part of the jury. You have to say, which is more reasonable? So here's a fun section. Oh, wait, Mr. Skeptic. Evil and suffering. It's the best evidence there is against a God. How could a God possibly allow the evil and suffering that we see? This is George Carlin. He's an atheist and a comedian. And he's going to walk me through this section. He says something is wrong here. War, disease, death, destruction, hunger, and poverty, torture, crime, corruption, and race walking. Have you ever heard of race walking?
It's absurd.
Somehow, so okay. Well, I'm going to show you what race walking is. This is a real Olympic sport.
That's my sport right there. Yeah. Sign me up.
Something's wrong. It looks like they need to go to the bathroom. Women participated in it too. If you're a race walker, if you do this, I'm sorry. It just something's wrong here.
Might as well just run.
All right, let's continue on. He says something's definitely wrong. It's not good work. If this is the best God can do, I'm not impressed. Results like these do not belong on the resume of a supreme being. This is the kind of stuff you'd expect from an office temp with a bad attitude. So let's go through what he says here. Let's talk about it a little. He talks about war, hunger, torture, crime, corruption. These are examples of evil. He talks about disease, death, and destruction. Examples of suffering. So evil, we have a desire for justice, and we have suffering. They seem like they're an obvious reality of this world. And George Carlin says something's wrong here. So wait a minute, hold on now. If you apply the naturalistic worldview honestly, then there's actually nothing wrong. Richard Dawkins says, the universe we have has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom. No design, no purpose, no evil, no good. Nothing but pitiless indifference. And in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Others are going to get lucky. You won't find any rhyme or reason or any justice. And finally, blindness to suffering is an inherent consequence of natural selection. Nature is neither kind nor cruel, but indifferent. There's nothing wrong here. There's no evil, no good, no justice, blindness to suffering. So I'm going to play a real little snippet, funny video here on how I will carry this through.
Excuse me. All right, move on. Nothing to see here. Please disperse. Nothing to see here, please.
There's no evil and suffering going on behind me. There's nothing to see here. It's not happening. But we don't think that, do we? And George Carlin doesn't think that. He says something's wrong here. C.S. Lewis again. He says, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has an idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? In order to know how it's not supposed to be, we have to know how it is supposed to be. And nature and materials already says it is already how it's supposed to be. There's nothing to see here. I think we all agree, probably. George Carlin agrees, something's wrong. So why does it exist? Why would a God allow evil and suffering? We're going to start with evil. free will is a good argument. Now, as a skeptic, I dismissed it. I didn't really think about it very much. But after I thought about it, I think it's pretty good answer.
What if, when God created human beings, he wanted them to be free? Freedom's a good thing. But if humans are to be free, they cannot be forced to obey God. Because freedom without choice is like a square circle. It's a logical contradiction. No choice, no freedom. God didn't want robots. He wanted real people.
So, ladies in the audience, have you ever had a man pursue you that you weren't really interested in? And they kept asking you out, and eventually, what would you say? I like you, but only as a friend. Guys hate you. Right? But he's pursuing you. He wants you to love him. So if he ends up taking you, locking him in your house, in his house, and doesn't let you leave and says, you are going to love me, are you going to love him? Of course not. Well, it's the same way with God. God could force us to do right all the time. God could force us to love him. But that would be a dictator. And we don't want a dictator. We're going to talk real quick on justice. I thought this was pretty funny. So someone got pulled over, actually in Prior Lake. And look at the comments. Double the fines. It's about time. Got what she deserved. So I'd love to be able to ask each one of them, if you got pulled over, did you want justice for yourself or would you like a warning? Right? We want forgiveness for ourselves. So remember that as we talk later this morning. We have a deep desire for justice, right? It's implanted in us. It's much like the objective morals. And if nature and materials is all there is, if life is all there is, justice will often never be served. You hear it all the time, right? Got away with murder. We never got justice. We want justice so bad, but we're not going to get it in this life for a lot of things. It's this deep-seated desire. Only can be satisfied by another world. Fully satisfied. Now we're going to spend a little time on pain and suffering. This is a tough one. Why would a God allow suffering? I can only offer what I've come to think of as deep thoughts, right? There's not a smoking gun here on why God might allow suffering, but there are some plausible reasons. First of all, take hunger. Some of this is on us because they estimate there's 1.5 enough food, 1.5 times to feed everybody in the world. So that's on us. In 2007, I completed my first triathlon. Now, that's not me, and it wasn't an Ironman. But sometimes we inflict pain on ourselves for a greater purpose. Sometimes there's suffering. I can tell you training for Ironman, it wasn't an Ironman, training was a sprint. So training for a sprint triathlon even isn't fun all the time. You hurt, there's suffering, but we know there'll be a benefit from it. Sometimes we actually do it to other people. So when my twins were 2 years old, about that time, when I showed them earlier, they had a tooth defect in their molars. They had an infection when they were younger and their molars didn't come in correctly. They had to have surgery to have them removed. And I will never forget the day for both of them, holding them while they put them to sleep, having to hand them over to a surgeon when I know they're going to suffer in the end, or for a while, right? When they came out, they were suffering, hurt, crying. It was horrible, but I knew it was for a greater good. We have the ripple effect. If you think of the events that happened for you to be here today, for you even to be born, can you imagine all the things that had to fall into place for that to happen? Some of those events were probably suffering. If you could look at the ripple effect across the world, then some suffering events may have a greater good that you can't see. There's a quote out there, I won't get it exactly right, I don't have it in my notes, but they say, if I had God's power, I'd change the world. But if I had his wisdom, I wouldn't change a thing. because I could see everything. We can't see everything. How about this one? God cares more about your character than your comfort. Yeah, this was a lame excuse as a skeptic, right? But another one, if you think about it, if you think about the characteristics that we most admire, things like courage and compassion, forgiveness, self-sacrifice, charity and honesty, just take these as examples. They all require the negative to even exist. I can't be courageous if there's no danger. I can't be compassionate to someone if they're not suffering. Right? So the negative is required to have the positive. So this one's actually a good argument, I think. And I'm going to finish this section of suffering with a quote from Bertrand Russell, who was an atheist. He says, "How can you talk about God while kneeling at the bed of a dying child?" That's a tough argument. It's one I wrestled with quite a bit going through this. And if you've ever had to do this, I'm very sorry. Don't mean to be taking anything there. It's an example. But if God and Christianity are true, which I've come to believe they are, who you are continues into the next life. There's an afterlife. There's hope. That's what I can talk about at the bed of a dying child. But if I ask Mr. Russell, what are you going to say at the bed of a dying child? Tough luck. Nature is what nature is. There's nothing to see here. See, the atheist worldview does not provide a better answer to this question. George Carlin also says, this is not good work. Well, who says God has to be good to exist? We're just talking about existence here. It has nothing to do with being good or bad. By the way, TikTok is bad.
Amen.
But it exists. It exists. He also says, I'm not impressed. Liking it or not has nothing to do with truth. I have a daughter. You've seen some pictures when she was younger. She was 16 years old at one point, and she said, I'm going to start dating. I didn't like it. I didn't think it was fair. I was not impressed. Didn't change the truth. So we can summarize this section by saying on the God side, something's wrong. We can see that. And there are some plausible reasons for it. But on the no God side, on the nature and materials, the answer, the explanation is there's nothing to see here. It's what you should expect. It's nature. Again, sit on the jury and ask, which explanation is more reasonable? So reviewing the evidence for God and the explanations I talked about, the design in life and the design in the world, that there is a complex design that comes from intelligence. Supernatural, I believe, many, if not all of them, exist. At least one I have to believe exists without a doubt. And the something is wrong points to the fact that there is another way. So the atheist worldview did have some answers, some decent explanations, but it didn't really fill in the picture that well. It was pretty incomplete. The God explanations, they formed a more complete picture. They were more cumulative in nature. They were more coherent in nature. Now, both have missing pieces. Both have pieces that don't fit. But one was clearly better than the other. And so I had to change paths. The path that I was on, nature and materials, just felt like it just ended. It had inadequate explanations for the DNA, for the machines, for the Big Bang, the laws of nature, the afterlife, consciousness, evil, and suffering. Just had inadequate explanations. That's how I felt. It just kind of ended. And it's really not that hard of a choice believing in God. Most people don't say, oh, you believe in God, blah, 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 right? But once you talk about what type of God, i.e. religion, and what that might demand of you, it gets a little harder. And that's what we're going to jump into next. So I believe a God exists. What am I going to do with that? Because only reincarnation. There's a lot of religions out there. This is Robin from Batman, and he actually said that.
God.
If you want to look it up, April 20th, 1966, season 1, episode 29. But I think he should have said holy sameness, because aren't these all the same? Really? Don't they all lead to the same place? Well, they're not the same. Not on the fundamentals, which is what matters. So for example, if a single God exists, then the Hindus and the Buddhists are wrong. If Jesus is the Messiah, the Jews are wrong. If Jesus was crucified, the Muslims are wrong. And if Jesus was not God, then the Christians are wrong. Now, they could all be wrong. But because they differ on the fundamentals, they can't all be right. They make exclusive claims. So I looked at the major faiths, and as you might guess, one of them stood out for me. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at the evidence that stood out for me. And it starts with a radical change. The world radically changed. We have historical sources that tell us about that radical change from unfriendly sources, people that don't like Christianity, as well as Christian books like the Bible. And we have eyewitness testimony. Now, this was by far the most influential area for me. So we'll get there. We'll talk about that. But first, we're going to talk about how it began. And a radical change occurred in history. Jews left a 4,000-year-old religion. And I can't overemphasize the radical change here. The Jewish people, they were good with God. They were God's chosen nation. And a few Jews from rural Galilee turned into, 30 million Christians in just 400 years. The traditions I've listed here, they were turned on their head. Sabbath turned into Sunday worship, for example. These Jewish customs are not allowed to change. These are from God, and they changed. Cowards were transformed into proclaimers. Gentiles, which are non-Jews, started following a Jew. That was radical. Paul, a main New Testament figure, a devout Jew, did a 180-degree turn from killing and persecuting the Christians to converting people to it. The Roman Empire was radically changed. Gladiator games stopped. Life became more sacred. Women gained freedom and dignity that they didn't have before the change. They couldn't even speak in public. They were properties of their husbands. Charity and compassion increased dramatically. And after years of persecution on and off, Christianity became the established religion of the Roman Empire. The date system of our world changed. AD meaning after Christ or in the year of our Lord, and BC before Christ. Now, we call it the first century. It wasn't the first century. There were a lot of centuries before it. It just changed because of a radical event. The world changed. Before Christianity, the world was a culture of dominance. The folks with the power dominated the weaker. That's the way it was. Christianity advocated love and service to others. Hospitals, orphanages, charities were originally created by Christians. Actually, after the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, a hospital began to exist in every cathedral town. You may or may not know this, but the first 100 or so of our universities were created by Christians. The Harvard model, Truth for Christ and the Church. Now, most have changed their models, become secular. Harvard's original model, like I said, was Truth for Christ and thing, but they've changed it now. I forgot what it is. I didn't write that down. There's no origin, there's no doubt their origin is Christian. So that's the radical change. Now we have to ask, well, why did this happen? It happened because of a man named Jesus. H.G. Wells, a historian, he says, I'm a historian, not a believer. But I must confess, as a historian, this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very center of history. Jesus Christ is easily the most dominant figure in all of history. This is Bart Ehrman. He's a New Testament scholar. I'm going to talk more about him later. Just know he's a New Testament scholar. And he says, the ancient triumph of Christianity proved to be the single greatest cultural transformation our world has ever seen. But when I started looking at it, looking at the evidence, something didn't add up. Right? He had no money. He had radical preaching, which I talked about already. A Jew preaching anti-Jewish customs. He had a horrible and embarrassing death. He hung out with tax collectors, women of questionable reputation, Samaritans. That was unheard of at that time. No politics. Stayed local, never wrote a book. How could someone like that cause that radical change I went over in the world? Well, the story says he did miracles and he was resurrected. And that's what caused the radical change to begin. Now, of course, I'm a skeptic. Far too easy to dismiss that. That's folklore, it's a legend, it was made up over time. Much like other religious movements, I think. But the truth was, I hadn't investigated any of this to justify that conclusion. I hadn't looked at it. So, let's look at what I found out. Talked about the historical evidence. We have three sources. We have the unfriendly sources. So these are sources outside the Bible, from writers who were not friendly to Christianity. We have early church leaders who wrote books, and we have the Bible itself. We're going to start with the unfriendlies, these secular sources. And these are the main ones to look at. These writings are in the 180 time period, and it's a story that they tell. This video quickly will tell overview of the story.
In fact, we can almost reconstruct the gospel just from early, non-Christian sources. Jesus was called the Christ, did magic, led Israel into new teachings, and was hanged on Passover for them in Judea, but claimed to be God and would return, which his followers believed, worshiping him as God.
So seeing these writings in context made a real difference for me, more than just hearing this, right? I can't review them all, it'll take real too long, but I'm going to review one in a little depth, because it's really interesting. This is Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman governor. We have 247 of his personal letters and 121 letters to the Emperor Trajan at the time. An extremely detailed writer. And you might be asking, why is there a picture of a volcano? That is Mount Vesuvius, and it erupted in 79 AD. And Pliny watched it from across the bay. And he wrote a detailed structure, or detailed writing of it. He's actually the only writing we have of it. And it's so detailed, it's often referred to as the Pliny eruptions. So, very detailed writer. So here's some of the things he wrote. He said, in the case of those who are denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. Interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment, and if they persisted, I ordered them executed. So it corroborates that even under the threat of death, they persisted. They were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to God. Corroborates that they viewed Christ as a God. Accordingly, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing female slaves, who were called deaconesses, but I discovered nothing else but excessive superstition, which was probably the resurrection. This corroborates inclusiveness, right? The slaves were included. Female slaves were deaconesses. The contagion of this superstition has spread not only to the cities, but also the villages and the farms. Corroborates that it's spreading rapidly. And then the Emperor Trajan says, you observed proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting cases of those who have been denounced to you as Christians. So it confirms that the Emperor Trajan was aware of Christianity as well. We're going to jump down and look at Lucian of Samosata. Very unfriendly, scornful of Christianity. He was a satire writer. He wrote plays. And we have 2 quotes from a play that he wrote. He said, "The Christians, worship the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. These deluded creatures, you see, have persuaded themselves that they are immortal and will live forever, which explains their contempt of death and willing self-sacrifice." So even satire, unfriendly satire, confirms the Christians and the radical change. Now, one of the things, of course, that bugged me as a skeptic is why isn't there more? Right? It bugged me. If he was this popular, man, he did all these changes, where are all the writings? I don't get it. Well, today, in our world, a text survives unless you destroy it. You have to actually make a motion to destroy it. In antiquity, the text would disappear unless you actually made an effort to save it. And for most ancient people, even important ones, even Roman emperors, we have very little textual evidence. The truth is, Jesus was an obscure figure, but the amount of material we have on him is far more than most, if not all ancient figures. For example, how about Pontius Pilate? He was a Roman official. Roman historians would write what's important to Rome, so you would expect to find writings about Pilate. Bart Ehrman says, "And what records from that decade do we have from his reign? His accomplishments, his decrees, the laws, the prisoners?" We have none. Nothing at all. How about Tiberius? He's a Roman emperor. He was a Roman emperor from 14 to 37 AD when Jesus was alive. We should have writings of him. Justin Bass says, "Tiberius was the most powerful man in the world. Jesus was one of the poorest. He even died on a cross during his reign. Yet we have far more reliable sources and closer to the time of Jesus' actual life than the Caesar of Rome." Great, so we learned about the radical change that happened, and it was radical. We started to look at Christianity, we started to look at the unfriendly sources. It's actually amazing to me how many of these unfriendly sources there are that we have. There's a lot that I didn't talk about. Josephus, you may have heard of him, he's a big one. I actually didn't bring him in because there are some controversies over whether he wrote things, were things added or not, but it's really telling to read it. But I didn't want to bring it in because it was a little sketchy, I think. They did actually, if you're interested, Josephus, they found some 10th century, this is pretty recent, 10th century manuscripts that are different than the later ones that they have that they're pretty sure were not added to, but they were added to, they have proof of that. So that's why I didn't bring him in, but boy, he wrote a lot of stuff. So when we come back, we're gonna take a break. Where are we at? Looks like the same thing, so we'll start at 5:02 again. We are going to talk about the Bible. We're going to talk about the student leaders, but then we're going to jump into the Bible. We're going to actually spend quite a bit of time in the Bible because I didn't think any of it was true. So we're going to look at some of the evidence there, and then we're going to just start on the eyewitness testimony. We'll finish that up after lunch. That's where the majority of eyewitness testimony and what was a game changer for me, that's where we're going to talk about that. And then we'll do the Q&A at the end. Cool, so let's take a break. We'll start again at 5:02.